The airport terminal buzzed with activity. Announcements echoed through the speakers, travelers hurried past, their suitcases rolling noisily on the polished floors. Amid the sea of well-dressed business travelers and vacationers, Alex sat alone on a hard plastic chair near the boarding gate. His simple clothes and worn-out backpack stood in stark contrast to the sharp suits and designer luggage around him. His wide eyes darted around nervously, taking in the unfamiliar environment. As the boarding process began, passengers lined up, handing over their tickets with ease. Alex stood hesitantly, clutching a crumpled economy-class ticket in his hand. His small frame was almost swallowed by the crowd as he approached the gate. Ms. Linda, the flight attendant, stood by the boarding gate with a polite smile that quickly faltered as her eyes landed on Alex. Her gaze narrowed as she scanned him from head to toe, her demeanor shifting from professional to suspicious. "Excuse me," she said sharply, stepping forward to block his path. Her voice was firm, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "Can I see your ticket?" Alex nodded quickly, holding out the ticket with trembling hands. Ms. Linda took it, glancing at it briefly before looking back at him with a raised brow. "Economy class," she muttered, her tone dripping with judgment. Her eyes flicked to his scuffed sneakers and patched backpack. "Are you traveling alone?" Alex nodded again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." Ms. Linda pursed her lips, handing the ticket back to him but not stepping aside. Her voice was louder now, her words clearly meant to be heard by those around them. "You're sure this is your ticket? Economy boarding is in the other line. We don't want any confusion here." Alex glanced at the sign, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. He quietly murmured an apology and stepped aside, clutching his ticket tightly. The passengers nearby exchanged glances, some whispering, others watching with curiosity. Ms. Linda's suspicious eyes lingered on Alex as he shuffled toward the correct boarding line, his shoulders hunched under the weight of humiliation. Ms. Linda adjusted her perfectly pressed uniform as she prepared for another routine flight. A seasoned flight attendant with over 15 years of experience, she prided herself on keeping the cabin in impeccable order. But over the years, her once warm demeanor had hardened into a rigid sense of control. She'd seen all kinds of passengers, and her judgments often came quickly and harshly. When her eyes landed on Alex, her mind was already made up. "Hey, kid!" she called out as Alex hesitated near the entrance to the plane. Her tone was sharp, her eyes narrowing as she approached him. "Are you sure you're on the right flight?" Alex looked up nervously, clutching his crumpled ticket in one hand. His voice was barely audible as he replied, "Yes, ma'am. My ticket says seat 24A. Ms. Linda snatched the ticket from his hand and scanned it with a critical eye before handing it back brusquely. "Well, hurry up and sit down," she snapped, waving him forward. "Don't hold up the line." Passengers behind Alex exchanged glances, some frowning at the harsh tone, while others seemed indifferent. Alex nodded quickly, muttering a quiet apology as he shuffled down the aisle, his head bowed to avoid the judgmental stares. His small frame seemed even smaller as he maneuvered through the narrow aisle, searching for his seat. As Alex reached his row, he lifted his worn backpack to stow it in the overhead compartment, but the bag slipped from his hands, tumbling into the aisle with a thud. The sound drew the attention of nearby passengers, who looked on with a mix of curiosity and impatience. Alex bent down quickly to retrieve it, his face flushed with embarrassment. Ms. Linda, who had been keeping a watchful eye on him, was by his side in an instant. She crossed her arms and sighed loudly, making no effort to hide her irritation. "Can't even handle your own bag?" she said mockingly, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Maybe you should have taken the bus instead of a plane." The cruel comment hung in the air, drawing quiet murmurs from a few passengers. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others looked away, unwilling to get involved. Alex's hands trembled as he picked up his bag and quickly shoved it into the overhead bin. He kept his head down as he slid into his seat, his face burning with shame. "Sit tight," Ms. Linda said curtly, turning on her heel and walking away without another word. As Alex sat silently in his window seat, he stared out at the tarmac, trying to block out the humiliation he felt. He clutched the strap of his backpack, as if holding onto it could shield him from the judgment surrounding him. Nearby passengers whispered quietly, their glances darting toward him and then away. The plane filled quickly, and the pre-flight announcements began, but Alex couldn't shake the heavy weight of embarrassment. His mind raced with thoughts of whether he even belonged here. The voices around him faded into a blur as he sank deeper into his seat, wishing he could disappear altogether. Meanwhile, Ms. Linda continued her duties, her demeanor brisk and efficient. To her, Alex was just another passenger who didn't fit the mold of what she considered acceptable. She prided herself on running a tight ship, and in her eyes, Alex was already a disruption. But little did she know, her assumptions and treatment of him would soon come back to challenge her in ways she never expected. As the plane taxied down the runway, Alex closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He told himself it was just one flight, just a few hours to endure. But the sting of Ms. Linda's words lingered, and the unease in the cabin remained palpable. The flight had barely begun, and already the stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal more than anyone could have anticipated. The plane cruised smoothly at 30,000 feet as Ms. Linda maneuvered the beverage cart down the aisle with practiced efficiency. Her face remained impassive, but when she approached Alex's row, her expression hardened ever so slightly. Without a second glance, she skipped his seat entirely, moving on to the next row as if he didn't exist. Alex watched silently, unsure if it was an oversight or deliberate. After a moment, he hesitated before raising his hand politely, his voice soft yet audible enough to reach her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Can I have some water?" Ms. Linda stopped, turning her head slowly toward Alex. Her lips curved into a sarcastic smile, but there was no warmth in it. "This isn't a charity, kid," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "We serve paying customers." The words struck like a blow, and a collective gasp rippled through the nearby rows. Passengers exchanged incredulous glances, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. One woman, seated 2 rows back, shook her head in disbelief. "That's uncalled for," the woman said loudly, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Ms. Linda ignored the comment, her focus fixed on Alex. He looked down, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his shirt as he struggled to swallow the lump in his throat. For a moment, it felt like the entire cabin was staring at him, and the weight of humiliation pressed down like a physical force. The kind elderly woman seated next to Alex leaned toward him, her gentle voice barely above a whisper. "Don't mind her, dear," she said, placing an unopened bottle of water into his trembling hands. "People like that don't deserve your attention." Alex looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was kindness and understanding in her gaze, a stark contrast to the coldness he'd been subjected to. He nodded slightly, his lips curling into a faint, grateful smile as he accepted the bottle. Ms. Linda, still lingering nearby, caught the exchange and narrowed her eyes but said nothing. She pushed the cart forward, her frustration evident in the sharp movements of her hands. As she continued serving drinks, murmurs of discontent grew among the passengers. Some whispered quietly about her behavior, while others glared at her openly, their disapproval impossible to miss. "I've never seen anything so rude," one passenger muttered to his seatmate. "That poor boy," another added, shaking her head. Alex sat quietly, sipping from the bottle of water as he tried to ignore the eyes around him. The elderly woman patted his hand gently, her small gesture of comfort doing more to soothe him than any words could. But even her kindness couldn't erase the sting of Ms. Linda's words or the sinking feeling of being singled out. What Ms. Linda didn't realize, however, was that her harsh words and actions weren't going unnoticed. Every cruel comment, Every act of deliberate neglect was being observed, and not just by the passengers around her. The world had a way of balancing itself, and soon her behavior would come back to haunt her in ways she couldn't imagine. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin lingered like an unspoken storm. Passengers stole glances at Alex, some with pity, others with quiet admiration for how composed he remained despite the humiliation he'd endured. And though Ms. Linda carried on as if nothing had happened, the growing whispers of disapproval among the passengers hinted at the reckoning that was fast approaching. Alex leaned back in his seat, clutching his backpack tightly. The kind woman's words echoed in his mind, giving him a small measure of comfort. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was far from over, and that his quiet presence would soon be at the center of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. Ms. Linda was midway through her routine checks when the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice, calm but commanding, echoed through the cabin. "Ms. Linda, please report to the cockpit immediately." Her brow furrowed as she glanced toward the cockpit door. Calls from the captain mid-flight were unusual, and a faint unease settled in her stomach. Straightening her uniform, she made her way to the front of the plane, her heels clicking against the aisle floor. When she entered the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot greeted her with tight smiles. The co-pilot handed her a slim file, the airline's logo embossed on its cover. Confused, Ms. Linda opened it and began scanning the contents. Her eyes widened as she read the name at the top of the document, Alexander Davis. She blinked, rereading it to make sure she wasn't mistaken. Below the name, the details were even more shocking. Sole heir to Davis Aviation, parent company of this airline. Ms. Linda's hands trembled as she clutched the file, her face draining of color. The weight of her actions hit her like a freight train. She looked up at the pilot, who was watching her with a knowing grin. "You've been treating the owner's son like a second-class citizen," he said, his tone equal parts amused and disappointed. I didn't know," Ms. Linda stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Exactly," the co-pilot said, leaning back in his chair. "You didn't bother to find out." The words echoed in her mind, striking a painful chord. The very same accusation she had leveled at Alex, assuming without knowing, was now being turned back on her. She felt a wave of panic rising as she tried to collect herself. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice shaky. "You're going to fix it," the pilot said firmly, "and you'd better start now." Ms. Linda nodded quickly, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a frantic urgency. She turned and hurried back to the economy cabin, her heart pounding. As she approached Alex's seat, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their earlier whispers of disapproval now replaced with curiosity. She forced a smile onto her face, though it wavered as she stopped beside him. "Mr. Davis," she began, her voice overly polite, "I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced during this flight." Alex looked up, his expression a mixture of confusion and surprise. He studied her carefully, noticing the abrupt change in her tone and demeanor. The kind elderly woman beside him raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "It's fine," Alex said quietly, his voice steady but guarded. "No, really," Miss Linda pressed, her words tumbling out in an effort to recover. "Please allow me to make it up to you. Is there anything you need? Anything at all?" Alex hesitated, unsure how to respond. The passengers nearby were watching closely, their curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in Ms. Linda's attitude. The elderly woman leaned toward Alex, whispering loud enough for those around her to hear. "Looks like someone realized who they were dealing with." Ms. Linda flushed, the sting of the comment adding to her discomfort. She straightened up, her forced smile still plastered on her face. "Please don't hesitate to let me know if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable," she said before retreating down the aisle, her steps hurried and unsteady. The passengers exchanged glances, some smirking knowingly, others shaking their heads. Alex meanwhile stared out the window, his thoughts swirling as the weight of the unexpected revelation began to sink in. The tables had turned, and Ms. Linda's judgmental assumptions had led her into a situation she would never forget. Ms. Linda stood at Alex's row, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she fought to steady her trembling voice. "Mr. Davis," she began nervously, her polished demeanor now replaced with a visible unease. I had no idea who you were. Please accept my deepest apologies." Alex looked up from his seat, his calm expression unshaken. He let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding, his voice measured but firm. "You don't have to apologize to me because of who I am," he said, locking eyes with her. "You should apologize because of how you treat people." The cabin went silent for a beat before the elderly woman beside Alex clapped her hands together, her voice breaking the silence. "Well said, young man." The passengers around them erupted into cheers and applause, their voices filling the cabin. Some nodded in agreement, others clapped louder, clearly satisfied with Alex's response. Ms. Linda's cheeks flushed a deep red as she glanced around, her discomfort now impossible to hide. She nodded quickly, her voice almost a whisper. "You're right. I'm sorry for the way I've acted. I'll do better." As Ms. Linda stepped back, retreating toward the galley, the intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice echoed through the cabin, calm yet enthusiastic. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special passenger on today's flight, Mr. Alexander Davis." Passengers exchanged surprised glances, and Alex looked up, startled by the announcement. The captain continued, "Mr. Davis is not only a valued guest but also the sole heir to Davis Aviation, the parent company of our airline. On behalf of the entire crew, I want to personally thank you for flying with us today." The cabin filled with another round of applause and cheers, passengers turning to look at Alex with newfound respect. The elderly woman beside him patted his arm affectionately. "See, dear? Some things always come full circle." Alex nodded slightly, offering a small smile. Though he appreciated the recognition, his mind lingered on the lesson of the day, a lesson Ms. Linda would likely never forget. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Alex sat quietly, his gaze focused ahead. The whispers of passengers filled the cabin, many still marveling at the unexpected revelation about him. When the seatbelt sign turned off, the captain himself arrived at Alex's row, extending a hand with a warm smile. "Mr. Davis, it's been an honor having you on board," the captain said, shaking Alex's hand firmly. "You're an inspiration, and we're grateful for your humility and grace." Passengers watched in awe as Alex stood, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The elderly woman beside him gave him an encouraging nod, and Alex smiled in return. As he moved toward the exit, he stopped next to Ms. Linda, who stood awkwardly near the galley, her posture stiff and her eyes downcast. Alex turned to her, his voice calm but carrying the weight of his message. "Treat everyone with respect," he said, meeting her gaze directly. "You never know who might be watching." Ms. Linda nodded, her expression a mix of regret and understanding. She whispered, "Thank you." Without another word, Alex continued toward the exit, escorted by the captain. As he stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, heads turned, passengers and airport staff alike pausing to watch him walk by. His quiet confidence spoke volumes, leaving an indelible impression on everyone who saw him.